All right. A couple more introductory words and also a little bit about reading, because I know a lot of you are interested in reading more. As we had a couple of people asking in the chat session, as far as I know, we're going to keep doing Monday morning modernism, or if you're in Europe, Monday evening modernism, but we'll keep doing it through the year on the first Monday of each month. And just by going to the website, you can keep up with the topics, and every 3 months or so, we're going to post fresh topics and keep moving forward. But it is indeed a free webinar that's going to continue. One thing I mention with every webinar is I want to mention really the author that I think was kind of my mentor, although I never met him. But for more than 30 years, I taught from this textbook, The Shock of the New. And The Shock of the New is the result of a BBC series called The Shock of the New that was made public in 1980 by Robert Hughes. The used books are very easily available on eBay or Amazon, and you can watch the original TV shows, which are real gems. You can see them, a lot of them on YouTube or the site ubu.com. You can watch them in their entirety. And they are spicy and opinionated and brilliant, and just a great thing to watch for your own self-education. And then one more acknowledgement. The book cover you see there on the right, that is my current bedside reading. I'm reading The Minotaur Years from the Life of Picasso by John Richardson. And John Richardson actually published 4 volumes of Picasso's life and only made it to 1943 before he himself passed away in 2019. And I have to tell you, people who like artist biographies were on edge. You know, how long will John Richardson live? You know, will he complete volume 4? And he did. I really wonder if his staff may try to work from his notes and create a 5th book. But if you get interested in today's early Picasso lecture, just go to your favorite online bookseller and look for volume 1. And that's where a lot of today's information came from. These are so readable, clearly written, a little bit gossipy, you know, enough gossipy, and so well informed by a writer who knew Picasso personally from the 1940s onward. So that's enough about sources. Let's talk about the artist. I want to say a few things about why it's so interesting to study Picasso, or why it's just so great to talk about him. I think the first thing I want to say is that the point of any lecture I give or any presentation, it is not to make you fall in love with Picasso's artwork. That's a matter of taste, you know, what you like, what you dislike. But I do want to give a good job of giving you context so you understand the man and you understand the history that was swirling around him. And I think you're going to get a richer experience from the artwork, whether you like or dislike it. But again, never here to work on your taste. That's yours personally. But some of the reasons that it's so interesting to learn about Picasso, here's just a few. He is the best documented artist in Western history. I mean, I can't think of another artist that's had so many articles and books, a very, very complete catalog raisonné that I know I've gone through at Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, where they have the complete set, you know, taking up a couple of bookshelves. But so many biographies, so much critical attention. So that, I think that's interesting to have so much material. If you want to see his baby pictures, they're very easy to find. Here he is at 3 years old. I think another thing that's interesting about Picasso are the contradictions, and there are so many of them. If you read John Richardson, especially when you get into later volumes, there are a lot of images of real family dysfunction, of cruelty on Picasso's part, of really, you know, atrocious ways of handling the women in his life and their relationships. But you'll also find out that when the Spanish Civil War broke out, he was probably the single most generous donor in terms of providing money for children's hospitals in Spain. He gave enormous amounts of money. And he also was very generous with his friends. So he has a polarizing personality in terms of how you judge him and what you think of his life. And, you know, what can you say about a man who, when he died, was honestly, in today's terms, a billionaire, but also a communist? So many contradictions, so much information, and such a fertile and interesting artist. This is Picasso's father, who throughout his life, Picasso always spoke of admiringly, said that the father was an enormously positive figure. And maybe the first thing you notice is that Picasso and his father don't share the same last name. His father was Jose Ruiz. Picasso was was a name in his mother's family, an Italian name. But as you can see here, his father was a painter. He was a specialist in genre pictures, especially of doves and pigeons. And there's all kinds of stories about, one I've heard is how when Pablo was a little boy, his father would cut off pigeon feet when making, stew for dinner, pin the feet to a board, and then, have young Pablo draw them. And you'll occasionally see nailed pigeon feet in a Cubist picture, so you kind of know where that came from. But absolutely, Pablo was a prodigy. The family watched with awe as he developed. He was kind of an indifferent student. And the story goes that when he went to a small, grammar school, first, second, third grade, he was shy, didn't like to speak very much. And then the headmaster's wife would take him back in the kitchen, and he always had small animals in his pockets, like, rats or mice. And he liked to draw when the other students were writing. At the Picasso Museum in Barcelona, you can see many of his juvenilia, his early images. And one thing you want to know about Picasso when you read his own statements is that he often exaggerated or lied. And in some of these exaggerations, there's a bit of truth. And one thing he used to tell people, he said, "I never drew like a child." And I'm going to rate that one maybe a C+. When you look at the way he drew at 9, it is clear that maybe his father had taught him, or intuitively he was already thinking about shading. When you look at the upside down pigeons, they have little cast shadows under their feet. There's certainly, some scribbling in the stands for the onlookers of the bullfight. But it's clear that from a pretty early age, he was thinking about drawing with some ambition and some sophistication. You can see how capable he was when you look at some of these early portraits of his family members. And he was born in 1881. So you can think about the age when he did these. The sepia portrait of his father, he did at the age of 15. Also the portrait of his mother the same year. But 2 years before, at age 13, an oil of his sister, Lola. So again, very capable. And I think one thing that often surprises people about Picasso, if you haven't studied him before, you really find out that his beginnings were very capable and very conventional. Everyone immediately can bring up an image of Picasso's modernism, but as a young man, he had the same art education that anyone would have had in Spain in that era. Here's another story about Picasso that may have a bit of exaggeration and a bit of truth mixed in, but I'll explain it the way I've read it. To get into an art academy, you had to take a drawing exam. And of course, an art academy would have been maybe for 18-year-olds, but he tried to enter at age 15. And the story goes, and we don't know if this is correct, but the story goes that you had 1 week to take the drawing exam, that you'd be given paper and charcoal, and you'd go in the cast room full of these kind of classical Hellenistic plaster casts, and you draw away. And then after 5 days to complete all these drawings, your portfolio would be graded. And if you were fortunate, you'd be given admission to the art academy. And Picasso's story was that he passed the exam, the 5-day exam, in 1 day and was admitted with a scholarship. So that may or may not be true, but he was precocious. This is actually a cast drawing he did after he was admitted. And when you look at 15-year-old Picasso, and when you look at that photograph, if he looks a little bit sullen, he is, because when he got into this school, his father forced him to have a haircut. And he liked long hair. He thought long hair was fashionable. He was very unhappy about the haircut, and it shows in the photo. And apparently he wore a wig to classes for the first couple of months because he couldn't stand the way he looked with the short hair. So the way that a conventional painter could make a career in Spain, there were two main routes. I mean, you could be a portrait painter or you could be a religious painter. Those were kind of the two roads to glory. So when Picasso was, working ahead in the academy, maybe in his second year, his father rented a room and completely set up this kind of situation here so that Pablo could make a complete religious painting called First Communion. And those are all Picasso family members posing for it. I think that's his sister Lola in the communion gown, maybe a cousin of his at the altar, his father and mother there in the on the left side. And you take a look at this and you say, this young man could already paint a pretty capable academic painting with glowing candles, with a brass chandelier, with the patterns of rugs. And I kind of imagine Jose, Pablo's father, as being a little bit like Tiger Woods' father, as really grooming his son, knowing, well, I've got a painter on my hands here. He's really going to move the family name forward. He's going to have a great career. So he was steering him into this proper career of being a religious painter. But when you look at the self-portrait, and you can see that there on the right, anyone who's raised a teenager knows that the plans of the parents are not always, what is going to happen. And you'll want to read John Richardson to read, all about the misbehavior of Picasso in his teens and his rebellions against his father. But I think the one anecdote that stands out for me, think about your son or daughter's first romance, the first person they bring home. Apparently, Picasso's first serious romance was with a circus bareback rider. And this was when he was a teenager going to the art academy. So imagine an older woman, imagine what his parents thought. He claimed, and this is another one of those lies with a bit of truth, but he claims he was sexually active from the age, I think, 9 or 10 onward, and he was sexually initiated by gypsies. So that's how that goes. Let's move forward a little bit. So Picasso was born in a town called Malaga, which was a little bit of a backwater. I hope I'm not offending anybody who's now lives in Malaga, but at the time, Barcelona was a more modern city, a bigger city. And so Picasso gradually, fought with his parents and said, I need to be in different towns. I need to be in the city. And he ended up in Barcelona for his first trip, I think when he was maybe 17 or 18. And he found the cafe life of Europe in Barcelona. And his hangout was this cafe and restaurant called the Four Cats. And for a long time, I used to wonder, where did the name of the restaurant come from? Were there cat sculptures, or, what was that about? And then someone explained it to me, but it's a little bit like a beatnik term. There were these 4 cats who owned the restaurant. So Picasso, immediately fit in. He made a lithographed menu cover in the style of Toulouse-Lautrec that you see here. And by the way, the young man sitting in the center of that archway is Picasso. And if you don't recognize him, that is Picasso. I guess we could say he's styling, he's showing off. He's wearing this long overcoat. He has woven oversized trousers and fancy polished shoes. He has what looks to me like a pilgrim hat and then a red wig and a cane. I don't know that he had any trouble with his legs, but you can see that he had a lot of affectations as a young man. He was a young dandy who was in the city for the first time. Apparently he made a lot of money doing caricatures at the four cats, just making sketches on napkins, some of which are still around. You see this one here from 1900 of Joaquin Mir, who was a modernist painter in Barcelona. So maybe the first style, the first way of working that you can connect Picasso with after the academic paintings is, I just say that Picasso was a modernist. He was a quick sketch artist. You can see in his self-portrait how dashing he was with the charcoal, how confident, how quickly he could work. Drawing, came easily and came naturally to him. And even in the ink sketch of Joaquin Mir, you can see that, that kind of dashing energy of modernism. So Barcelona was, one way to catch the vibe of the modern city. But Picasso went back to his parents again and asked for more money, said that he really, really needed to be in Paris, which of course was the city of Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, the city of museums and art dealers. And between 1901 and 1906, with a few side trips and a few trips back to Spain, Picasso mainly lived in Paris. And if you were here for the previous webinar, we talked a little bit about the Eiffel Tower, the sights of Paris, what Paris felt like as a modern city. And you have to imagine for Picasso, this is where he got firsthand exposure and got to see the canvases of Manet, Van Gogh, Toulouse-Lautrec, and Gauguin. And one thing that I have been understanding, reading John Richardson's books, is that Picasso was absolutely gobsmacked by Van Gogh. Van Gogh was a very, very important artist to him, kind of the model of an artist. And I understand he kept, I think it was a quote from Van Gogh in his wallet most of his life. So think about the impression the city was making and that the art was making, you know, tremendous, tremendous exposure. And the first show that Picasso had in 1901, the story goes that he made the entire show in about a week, working on cardboard because he didn't really have enough money for canvas. He really was a starving artist back then. And most of the paintings were wet when they were exhibited. And here's one of a showgirl, a woman in a plumed hat, and also this famous self-portrait with all the Van Gogh colors in the face. Yo, Picasso, which, you know, makes me think of a rapper, again, you know, turning at you with that tremendous panache. And look at those out of the tube cadmium colors, those reds and oranges, and the ghoulish green at the edge of the face. It really is, you see a tendency of Picasso here that's going to be part of his entire artistic career. He took what he liked. He liked Van Gogh, he took it. He worked with it, and then he moved on. A scene of the nightlife. And again, imagine, you know, the music, the gas lamps, the prostitutes, you know, the society men, all of that, the debauchery. So Picasso got in some trouble in the early years in Paris. And again, you want to read a full biography to learn more about it. But he had a roommate, was a young poet, was also a Catalan, named Carl Casagamus. And Casagamus was kind of the opposite of Picasso. He was quiet, he was dependable, he was a bit shy, and he kept to himself. Whereas Picasso was, you know, outrageous, you know, promiscuous, very much a diva kind of a figure. And they were roommates for a while, which I guess it kind of worked out because they used each other's strengths and weaknesses. I understand that Casagamus usually paid the rent when Picasso was out of money. But through a complicated set of circumstances, Casagamus, it sounds like he was maybe set up by Picasso with a woman named Germaine, who he fell in love with, but he was also impotent, and the romance was a disaster. And at a group, in front of a group of people at a restaurant in Paris, Casagamus gathered people together, took a shot at Germaine, which missed her. The bullet fell to the floor, and then killed himself with all of these guests present. Picasso was not there, but it was a very, very dramatic suicide. And Picasso felt some guilt over what had happened. I think he realized that everybody had been cruel and was kind of living on the edge. There'd been practical jokes, and he had a tremendous sense of grief and some sense of responsibility when Casagamus died. So one painting he did is a Van Gogh style funeral portrait of Casagamus, who, by the way, Picasso did not attend the funeral. Picasso left Paris immediately after his friend killed himself because of the way that they were enmeshed. And one of the details of what happened is that when Casagamus' mother, who was a good friend of Picasso's mother, got the news of her son's suicide, she dropped dead of a heart attack. So it was like a double tragedy, domino tragedy. This is the beginning of a really famous period in Picasso's art. This is the beginning of the Blue Period. And you can see that what happens in Picasso's art when he does return to Paris and he begins painting again, it's almost as if painting becomes a kind of atonement, a kind of apology. and also an acknowledgement of his own grief. So here's one example of what he did. He did this burial of Casagamus, this burial picture, and it probably falls in the tradition of what you and I might call an apotheosis. An apotheosis is a traditional Catholic picture where a holy figure rises to the heavens. And we should get back to this topic, but let's say something about Picasso and Catholicism. He always claimed that the Catholic Church was not important to him. He didn't attend church. He wasn't a religious person. And yet when he died, someone asked his widow, Jacqueline, how Catholic was Picasso? And she said, oh, he was more Catholic than the Pope. So, you sort that out in terms of how he felt about Catholicism and about an apotheosis and about religious pictures. But that's how he painted Casagamus. He's in the shroud at the mausoleum in the bottom of the picture. And then you can see it's almost a kind of a, I don't know what to call it, a Hugh Hefner fantasy funeral, where Casagamus rides away on a white horse, attended to by a nude woman, off to eternity. But most of the Blue period was much more somber. And Picasso also developed a kind of a social conscience that he hadn't had before. And he did a large series of paintings where he visited these special hotels or hospitals that were mainly filled by women with advanced venereal diseases, especially syphilis. And the story goes that in Paris, I mean, this is before venereal disease had a cure, that people who with advanced syphilis would often go through mental degeneration, and they needed to, live off of the street. They wore something called the Phrygian bonnet, which you can see these women wearing, and it would mark them in public. Sometimes groups of them would be taken out of the hospital and they would shop in Paris, but they'd be, seen wearing the Phrygian bonnet, which kind of made them like a do not touch social category. But Picasso saw in them a kind of a Mary Magdalene type of a figure. And he drew and painted in Saint-Lazare, which was one of these hospitals. And you can see that the woman on the right in this Blue period picture is suckling an infant, as if she is almost a kind of a holy mother. And when Picasso painted himself in 1903, it's very, very different from Yo Picasso. Those, garish oranges and greens are gone, and you get the new solemn Blue period Picasso. And one anecdote goes that when he went back to see his parents in Spain from time to time, he would not let his mother wash that coat. And when she yelled at him, why can't I wash the coat? He would say, Mother, it's Parisian dust. He didn't want to lose the Parisian dust and dirt from his outfit. So during the Blue period, this kind of new sobriety and consciousness pervades the work. It's often very dour, kind of sad work, as one might expect for the Blue period. But there is a gradual theme of healing and rebirth. You almost get the feeling psychologically that Picasso is remaking himself, reconsidering his own life, maybe even revisiting his own childhood. So for example, in this picture, The Old Jew, there is a blind man begging on the street. And by the way, Picasso made blindness a very important theme in a lot of his later work. And but this blind man has a young son whose eyes are wide open, who has looks like he's gotten a piece of fruit from a passerby, and he is the eyes, and you might say the future of the older man. So in a way, it's a picture about a father-son relationship. And it says something about how Picasso felt about his own father, that his own father had sacrificed for him so he could, he could live and he could move forward. The Blind Guitarist has another one of these kind of mixed themes. I mean, it's obviously a kind of a dour painting of a street musician, a very attenuated figure with very slim fingers, long fingers, elongated legs. You can see the tendons in his neck. But what this man has going for him is he has his music. So it's a picture about the state of being an artist, that when you're an artist, you may be, you may be poor, you may be depressed, you may be facing difficulties, but music in this case, or your creativity allows your heart to speak in one way or another. And by the way, Picasso's art is always full of visual puns. So if the guitar reminds you a little bit of a woman's body, I think you're on track. I think Picasso might have been hinting at that as well. And all of this leads to the first painting where Picasso very self-consciously, I mean, with a lot of planning, decided he was ready to make a masterpiece. And this painting is a very simple title. It's called The Life or La Vie in French. And here's the story of this painting. So now, having painted in the blue style for nearly 2 years, Picasso did something that I think was maybe brave, but a little bit peculiar. He went back and re-rented the studio where he and Casagamus had once lived together. And when I say it's a little peculiar, you know, maybe if you'd had a friend that had gone through a suicide, you might want distance from that place. You might want to be somewhere else. But he retook that space almost as if to, you know, one more time, go back to that friendship and see if he could make atonement for it. And he bought a large double canvas on which he began painting. And the painting went through a couple of stages that I'll show you in a moment. But what you see here on the left is you see a couple that includes Casagamus and Germain. And behind them, there are two, I don't know if they're paintings or drawings, but two Picasso works on the back wall. If you take a look at them, they are really divided by the hand gesture that the male figure makes. And what John Richardson says about that is a gesture from the tarot deck. Well, that would be another topic, you know, Picasso and the tarot deck, but it's a gesture that means above and below. Has a raised finger and a thumb pointing down. And you notice that gesture is at the union of these two paintings. And the difference between the two paintings, which both have these kind of, you know, bent over female figures, is that the one in the lower half is all alone. Whereas in the upper image, you have two figures clutching each other, so they have each other. And it almost seems to say that even in life's despair, in life's dark moments, if you have each other, you have something to carry you forward. So maybe we almost have a kind of a definition of heaven and hell in the pictures behind Casagamus on the wall, one deeper blue than the other. But then we also have a figure who walks in from the other edge carrying a child, maybe one of the women, maybe one of the former prostitutes, the Mary Magdalenes from the Hôpital de Saint-Lazare. And she looks in very, very somberly at this couple and makes eye contact with them. And when this painting has been x-rayed, the x-ray is not that great, but it shows you a little bit of what was going on. The really interesting part is that the male figure originally had Picasso's features. So Picasso painted himself and Germain as the couple. And then the very last thing he did was put the features of Casagamus on the male figure. So it's almost as if saying, I wish I could give you this child. I wish I could give you this woman. I wish I could give you, you know, life. It should have been me who's gone, who's painted out of the picture, and not you. And that's just one interpretation of the picture. It's a very ambiguous picture. You know, it's not meant to, I used to like the saying in art history class that most paintings don't come with an instruction manual, but it's a painting, it's full of religious feeling. And yet it's from a secular world. It's a modern picture about a modern situation and a modern relationship, replaying that religious vocabulary to give you loaded, potent symbolism and to give the painting this mood of importance. When you look at this picture that a little pastel made afterwards, there's really one thing that I notice about it. And it's that the woman in the picture is now doing some work, right? Rather than just being a figure curled up in the corner of a hospital, she has an apartment. She's doing her ironing. You know, like Picasso, she seems to be moving ahead. Work is a sign of positivity and optimism. Germain stayed in Picasso's life as his mistress for a number of years. And he did this painting, which now we're entering the Rose period. We're entering a period where Picasso's colors warmed up and bloomed a little bit, just as his own life seemed to heal and move forward. And the subject matter of the blue Picasso, looking toward the rosy world of his lover and finding solace and beauty in her, is a very, very powerful theme that would be repeated again and again in Picasso's career. Apparently he had a neighbor where he lived that had a pet crow, and she made this kind of fantastic manneristic drawing. And look at the extra joints in those fingers that make you feel this kind of sensitivity, sensuality in the way she caresses and kisses the bird. Fantastic, fantastic draftsmanship in her features. Picasso spent a lot of time at Montmartre at a bar called the Le Panagio, which means the active rabbit, the happy rabbit. There must be a sexual pun in there somewhere. And during this period, he tried to imagine himself sometimes as a harlequin, as a member of a traveling circus troupe. And he kind of created a whole family of other performers that would accompany him in many of these paintings. It's another picture that mixes a certain solemnity with a sense of possibility, because the boy and we'll say his mother or his sister, they have each other, and they have, it looks like a career as traveling performers, even though they have to split a very, very small meal. In this one, I think it's fair to say that both of these might be Picasso self-portraits. It's almost like he shows his older self raising his younger self. There's so much to say about Picasso. I'm going to try and slow down a little bit. I know I've been moving quickly. I don't know how the face feels to people in the webinar, but I want to slow down with this picture because it's again going to give you a feeling about how complicated Picasso's process and ideas could be in a single painting. So this painting came after he visited the Louvre Museum, which of course he did all the time in Paris. And he saw a painting by the academic painter Ingres in which a young woman gave a Roman salute, which later became the kind of, doesn't show up on my background, the fascist salute, but the raised hand. He seized on that gesture. He thought that gesture was very, very interesting. And he came back and began to paint this woman in profile, making that gesture. But then he transformed the meaning of the gesture. And let's analyze that a little bit. So the young woman, Spanish young woman, looks to one side of the canvas, looks away from us, doesn't make eye contact, and makes this very dramatic gesture. And the gesture almost seems to say, stop where you are, right? Like a crossing guard gesture that kind of keeps you at a distance, pushes you away. But as one hand does that, the other hand is lowered and it has a closed fan. And of course, the fan in Spain or other Latin countries has always been used for flirtation. It's not just a little air conditioner. And of course, flamenco dancers do this. Having your face behind the fan was a way of avoiding eye contact. And then when you lower it, it's a way of flirting. And Picasso was very interested in something called the mirada fuerte, the strong glance, the flirtatious glance. And so what's happening in this picture is, on the one hand, the woman is telling you, keep your distance. But with her other hand, it's almost like saying, well, I folded up my fan and I am looking at you. I am willing to make eye contact. It's a kind of a picture about someone who's saying, you can get to know me, but only so much. And I think that's a really, really interesting kind of set of body language, set of images for this moment in Picasso's life, where maybe he's becoming a public figure again. He's beginning to achieve some fame. The Casagamus incident is falling away, but there's only so much that he will tell you about himself. It's interesting to know that later in his life, Picasso was very, very embarrassed by the Blue Period. When people would ask him about Blue Period paintings, he would just say, oh, that junk I made when I was a young man. He thought it was too sentimental, but he thought it was too revealing. in this next Rose period painting, another very, very complicated painting, young man with a pipe, all kinds of ideas and references come together. And I'll tell you a few of them that have been mentioned. On the one hand, Picasso had been seeing the works of Gauguin, the works that were done in Tahiti of Polynesians. And among the works that he saw in Paris, he saw a picture of a mahu. And a mahu was a young male priest who had been castrated and who often dressed in women's clothing. And Picasso was fascinated by the idea of a mahu, an emasculated young man. So that might be one place that this came from. But he also was interested in the poetry of Rimbaud, who had described a dark angel. And so from those ideas, and maybe, to some degree from the idea of a self-portrait, he created this young man in blue who holds a pipe. And when he looks at you, now you do have a figure with eye contact, unlike the young woman looking away. But when you look at his eyes, you can see how mask-like his features are. It's almost like there is no one home, right? Slits in the mask of a face, and also kind of an uneven facial structure. And behind him are these kind of angel wings made of flowers. And there's also a kind of a headdress made of roses. And you have these kind of paradoxical things put together. You have this image of a very tender, poetic young man surrounded by imagery of flowers. And yet he looks out at you with maybe great suspicion, or even a sense of not wanting you to be there. And my favorite comment, the best comment I ever got about this when I was teaching, is I had a student raise his hand actually to interrupt my lecture, which was fine. He wanted to stop me with this picture, and he said, I caught my younger brother smoking weed in the bathroom, and that's exactly the way he looked at me. But that was one of the best comments of all time, because it is a picture of a kind of an adolescent countenance. And it's also a certain picture of androgyny, of maybe Picasso acknowledging that to be between male and female is, in a sense, one of the essences of creativity. So really, really interesting, coming from a painter that would be known for his machismo throughout his life. But one of the most complicated Rose period pictures. Oh, something about the pipe. I used to always get the question about this picture. Is it a tobacco pipe, or did Picasso ever smoke drugs? And from what John Richardson says, Picasso briefly did try opium, although this is not an opium pipe, and it was around this time. But apparently, after he smoked opium and really enjoyed it, had a great experience, the German painter across the hall named Wiegels, who had shared the opium with him, committed suicide. And that scared Picasso, so that he did not use opium again after that. So I don't think of Picasso as a drug user, and I don't think of him as a drinker that I know of either, other than wine at meals like any Spaniard living in France. There's a kind of transition that's happening in this period when we get into 1906. Rather than having maybe a single color focus like blue or rose, we now get a fuller palette. Picasso is traveling, painting in Holland at the end of 1905. And then in 1906, he got back and painted some peasants that he had seen in the border town of Gossol. And in those peasants, you see some of the distortion and the changes in we'll say the scale of their figures, of their body parts, that tells you that Cubism is around the corner. And you also, in this period, you get more and more references. You get more and more of the idea that Picasso is storing up art images that are meaningful to him, and getting a kind of a reference book in his head of the kind of art that he would like to draw on as he takes his career forward. So here, for example, an archaic Kouros from the Louvre shows up as a self-portrait, boy leading the horse. And in this portrait of Gertrude Stein, you actually get the influence of Iberian sculpture, which I'll probably talk about in the next lecture, the art of ancient Spain, where the eyes, where the mirada fuerte was so important. I think what I'll do, I think I'll make this my last picture because it's a very important picture. So let me tell you about Gertrude Stein, and then we'll turn over for questions. So Gertrude Stein is someone you probably have heard of, particularly if you like literature, because she was a great of the modern literary scene. She was an American Jewish woman, and she was a lesbian living on the bank, the left bank, with her lover, Alice B. Toklas. Apparently, she made the best hashish brownies on the left bank. And Alice was, excuse me, not Alice, but Gertrude Stein was she was a figure that if you were an American in Paris, you had to come and visit her. She was a close friend of Hemingway's. She got to know Picasso. She got to know Joan Miro. Originally, when she first met Picasso, he didn't make much of an impression. She called him, the little Spaniard who would not shut up, was what she said about him. But as she got to know him, she began to understand and be impressed by his work, and she commissioned a portrait. And what's significant about this portrait is it represents a very, very big change in the way Picasso got his subject matter. And what happened was he started the painting using her as a live model. So he would come to her apartment, she'd pose, she'd be still, he would paint her. And this went on for a couple of sessions, and then it was not going well. Picasso didn't like the results. He was unhappy with how it went. And after some frustration, he just took the painting home and didn't work on it for a while. Then, after a break, he apparently came back to the painting in a burst of inspiration and finished it from memory and brought it back to Gertrude Stein, who was, I think, at first indifferent to it. But later, when the Germans came to Paris, it was one of the two paintings that she took with her, when she was leaving in a hurry as the Germans made their way into Paris. And it has this fantastic kind of uneven mask-like face, which captures a certain probing quality of her character. But I'm going to say the significance of this painting is it is really the last major painting. This doesn't include drawings, but the last major painting we know of where Picasso tried to do a portrait from a live model. After that, he tended to work from memory. And it's very, very significant because memory gave him more creative freedom and unlocked him to try the distortions of Cubism.